Now, you want to talk about China?
We haven't talked about China much recently, and we have to keep talking about China. I mean, China obviously is the second largest economy in dollar terms in the world, almost the largest economy in the world if you look at purchasing power parity.
Yeah, I think it is the largest.
Yeah, and it's totally off the scale on so many things. World's largest exporter, world's largest manufacturer. Its naval construction capacity apparently 200 times that of the United States. Controls 85 to 90% of the key bits of the green energy sector, from batteries through to the cobalt, the lithium, increasingly dominating electric vehicles. On the one hand. On the other hand, facing real economic headwinds because of the collapse of the property market, which made up 20-25% of their economy. Lots of people are really struggling because many ordinary Chinese put 70-80% of their savings into apartments that are now worth a fraction of what they were when they bought them. Very little demand. People aren't spending in China. So China's raked up its exports and its trade balance is now in a very odd situation. So it's running a trade surplus of nearly $100 billion a month, of which about $30 billion is going to the US, $20 billion to Europe. And it's just been challenged by NATO in the Washington meeting, which has accused China of supplying machine parts, which are very useful for Russia in its fight against Ukraine, and has also criticized it for cyber espionage and disinformation. So, yeah, I think worth raising China. And I think the question of how Labour deals with China, how Britain deals with China is going to be important because, broadly speaking, you've got bipartisan agreement in the US to be very aggressive on China. So we talked about tariffs of over 100% on electric vehicles from China, 60% tariffs threatened by Trump on all Chinese exports to the US. Europe, on the other hand, has to be very cautious because 50% of the profits of the European automobile and luxury goods industry is made in China, so they can't afford a trade war. And so many of the component parts of German cars come in and out of China.
When I was in Germany for the Euros, and especially in Stuttgart, which is the home of Mercedes-Benz, there was a lot of angst and grief that the VIPs were all being driven around in BYD cars because Chinese cars were one of the sponsors.
Right.
Your point about how the British government deals with them is very, very interesting because on the one hand, I think there probably is a feeling that David Cameron got too close and then that Johnson sort of was a bit all over the place and then Liz Truss was much more in the kind of American Republican place and then Sunak I wasn't quite sure of Sunak's position on China.
Well, he sounded softer than Liz Truss, didn't he? I mean, Liz Truss was very much like, this is a Cold War with China and I think Sunak was more trying to look at, well, he was trying to get growth off the ground, wasn't he? So
But if you think about the competing interests there will be, so Rachel Reeves as the Chancellor will be wanting to focus on the economy, David Lammy as Foreign Secretary will be wanting to be focusing on diplomacy. And yet, I read earlier today of George Robertson, who was Defence Secretary and then NATO Secretary General during the new Labour years. He's part of this strategic defence review. And one of the first things he's talked about is this deadly quartet. He used this phrase, the deadly quartet, which was perilously close to George Bush's axis of evil.
Right.
And this is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as a military threat.
Yeah.
So managing those sort of different competing pressures within that relationship is going to be a very, very tricky balancing act.
And one quick, obvious example is that China can now produce reliable electric vehicles for a few $1,000s. I mean, their most low budget one's about $8,000. They're certainly producing for about half the cost of Europe. So if Labour is going to achieve its energy transition and get people into electric vehicles by 2030, and it wants to do so in a way that doesn't put huge burdens on the poorest households, it would have to bring in these cheap Chinese vehicles because they're about half the cost. If, on the other hand, they decide that for national security reasons and protecting British car industry, they want to put up the tariffs high in the way the US did, then that transition is going to be much, much more expensive. And it gets even more complicated. You talked about that Mercedes conversation, but the German car industry is conflicted because on the one hand, the import of Chinese vehicles might mean that people are buying less European vehicles. But on the other hand, the biggest market for Mercedes is in China. Yeah. So they can't afford to have certainly the biggest market in terms of profit margin is in China. So they can't afford a trade war. One other thing, just before we move to the end, China also, again, trying to flex its diplomatic muscle. It's hosting yet again a meeting of Hamas and Fatah. So these are the two big Palestinian factions for peace talks in Beijing, including the Chinese foreign minister. And this is an attempt to try to define how Gaza could be governed in the future. Would Hamas step back? Would they disarm their armed groups? What role would Fatah play in the government of Gaza? So here's China really inserting itself into something very, very central. Any thoughts on that?
The first thought I had was that given that the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, I presume is right up there on the target list of the Israelis as they go about their business of eliminating Hamas. I mean, that is quite a tricky logistical operation to get him to Beijing. Yep. Or would they actually, for something like that, because the Chinese are involved, would they think, give him a free pass? I don't know. But look, it isn't. You're right that normally when we've had really big foreign policy crises in the past, the Chinese approach has tended to be to kind of sit them out. But this, as you say, is very much them putting themselves right at the center of something and playing a role that you might have expected the Americans to play in a previous incarnation.
Well, Alistair, thank you. We've covered a lot of ground, and before we pat ourselves on the back too much for attacking China for its supply of machinery to Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war, we shouldn't forget that Europe is still buying Russian gas, particularly liquefied natural gas, LNG, as the pipelines have gone down, and still sending billions of euros into Russia through buying that gas. And that's largely because Hungary, Austria, Slovakia is still very dependent on that gas. So, and the Ukraine front line is in a tricky situation. It looks like Russia just retook another settlement in the last couple of days. So yeah, watch the space on Ukraine. We need to get into Ukraine again.
You mentioned Orban there. Final point for me. He turned up at both the football games that I went to, even though in one of them Hungary wasn't playing. And he was also at the final.
Oh, goodness.
England against Spain.
Will you tell us a little, and can you give us a little bit of your sense of that game? What is the Alistair view on that game?
Spain won 2-1. My view of that game is that the best
I did actually watch it. I did see what happened.
Well, what did you think?
Well, I knowing absolutely nothing about it, it did seem as though Spain had the ball much more than England and were passing it much.
That's what we call greater possession. Yeah. No, I think Spain were the best team in the tournament. I think England did very, very well to get to the final. England didn't really play to the best of their capacity, I don't think, through the tournament. So I think that although England fans will be very, very disappointed, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that the better team did not win.
Are we supposed to be cheerful because we've got a young team that could do well under a new manager and that we...
Yeah, you definitely got some very, very good... I thought Mainu might have been the young player of the tournament, but the Spanish youngster might have won the overall player of the tournament. No, I think, listen, England can be very, very hopeful about the future, but it does seem remarkable. I can remember watching England winning the World Cup in 1966 as a 9-year-old, 58 years ago, in a police station in Longtown, near your old neck of the woods.
Longtown was my
because my dad
constituency.
was dropping us off to be picked up by other relatives. Politics and football, Rory.
Yeah.
There was a very interesting... So if you imagine being the British ambassador to Germany, who's had to be part of this thing through the whole time, at the final, she had to look after Prince William, Prince George, Keir Starmer, Lisa Nandy, and I don't know if you saw, there was quite a lot of bilateral stuff going on. There was a very funny picture of